Welcome to the Room to Bloom podcast, equipping you to live redefined, renewed, and restored. I'm your host, Julie Raboa. Let's tackle this week's topic. Welcome to another episode of the Room to Bloom podcast. This week I have special guest Amber J. Parker, who is here to speak with us about overcoming trauma and triggers with EMDR therapy. And so I'll let her explain what EMDR is, but welcome, Amber. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Amber, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself, what your background is, and what your professional training is, and what it is that you do?
So professionally, I am trained as a physician assistant, a PA, and in the mental health space, I got into it because I was a caregiver for my husband through mental health crisis. I am a trauma healing advocate. I have the unique perspective of seeing mental health from three sides. I've been a caregiver for trauma. I've also been a trauma survivor. I've walked through my own trauma, and then obviously from that medical background as a PA can see mental health through a slightly different lens. I write on my website, my blog, choosejoyinthemidst.com, and I write on faith and psychology, so the integration of the powerful combination of when we have faith in God plus psychology for trauma healing.
Well, thanks for sharing. It sounds like you've got a lot of experiences from different perspectives, which I think makes your contribution today so very powerful and needed. And so I know you shared with me before that your husband began to heal from trauma, and I was hoping you could share a little bit more of what he needed to heal from and how you were able to help him heal with psychology and the combination of faith, because it is very powerful.
Certainly. Well, our story begins actually a lot of years prior to when mental health came knocking at our door. My husband was in combat. He is a veteran now, but there was combat trauma that occurred with one of his buddies dying by IED blast. That was something that he compartmentalized and, didn't know that he was doing it, but pushed it down. And then you fast forward many years later, and it began to attack him in nightmares, and he began to try to take care of that on his own. We all have different coping strategies that we that we try to use to deal with difficult things for comfort or to numb it or whatnot. Thankfully, God allowed me to discover that he was dealing with what I told him was, you're dealing with PTSD. This is what we're, facing right now. And he was using some self-medicating with alcohol and some sleep meds his doctor had given him. So then that kind of started about almost a 2-year journey for us where I was alongside him, supporting him, caregiving for him, advocating, and it did enter for him into also some other additions of depression and suicidal ideation, and then suicide attempts and hospitalizations, and we were in a battle for his life. And so in that, I was navigating, trying to keep my husband alive, while he was very ill with mental health. And so out of that, obviously, learned a lot in terms of trying to find the right therapy for him that might help in his healing. And then also in terms of, I grew a lot praying in my prayer life, in terms of praying significant spiritual warfare prayers over him. And as time went on, being able to bring in others to be praying over him as well.
Well, what a journey. Thank you so much for sharing
Yeah.
that, because I know that your husband is not the only one who has struggled with PTSD and,
Hmm.
some unhealthy coping and, really taking a toll on mental health.
Yes.
You mentioned the word compartmentalize. And so I was
Hmm.
hoping you could explain a little bit more what that word means.
Okay. So there can be memories that we deal with and we don't even realize that we're pushing them down. And we can have something that actually EMDR therapy calls stuck memories or stuck emotions, stuck beliefs that need to be processed to be unstuck. And so I think for my husband, that memory, which was trauma, um, he didn't know what to do with it. And obviously, he didn't have the knowledge that we both have now. As we've both gone through a lot of therapy, we've learned a lot over the last many years. And so he, it kind of got tucked away. And then for some reason, many years later, it began to significantly affect him and affect his quality of life.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I know that really helps people try to understand if, maybe they're doing that as well.
Hmm.
But in addition to that, I was hoping you could explain what triggers are, because that word is used
Hmm.
quite frequently. And I just want to give people a very strong foundation for what that word means.
Certainly, yeah, that term is thrown around a lot, but for trauma specifically, I believe trigger is going to have a very distinct description. So a trigger is going to be anything that was firing at the same time as the trauma memory. So there's a quote: "The neurons that fire together wire together." And so when your mind or your brain is processing information at the same time, even something completely unrelated or irrelevant to that memory, maybe something that was in a room or the color of a shirt, or something that wouldn't really make sense. Why would an orange shirt make me feel tense and anxious and upset? And it's because that orange shirt happened to be there at the same time that a trauma memory was occurring. And so those two things become associated. And so then you fast forward, you don't realize what triggers you have. It's just as you kind of discover them almost. It can be anything sensory, something we see, something we hear, a touch. It could be a very specific noise. Obviously I said something you hear, but it could be a smell. So anything that all of a sudden makes you feel that tense, that anxiety, or takes you straight back to that memory is going to be a trigger.
Okay, thank you so much for explaining that. I think that's going to be really
Yeah.
helpful for a lot of people, especially because they might have these feelings, but not really understand where they're coming from. And so, in
Hmm.
that way, how can that help people begin to identify their triggers?
Certainly. So I put together a resource. It's a short resource, but it helps. It's called the Fight or Flight Guidebook, and it's kind of like a clue catcher. So you're sort of on a hunt to identify triggers that you have, and sort of how to do that. Kind of what I talked about already. When you are feeling anxious or upset, all of a sudden, and you feel that fight or flight response happening, then you're going to want to ask yourself some questions to identify those triggers. Because when you are able to begin to understand why you're feeling a certain way and what your triggers are, I believe that begins to give empowerment to you. Those with trauma, no matter what the source of the trauma is, I think we all can struggle with agency. feeling like we have the ability to have control over ourselves and our choices. And so when that fight or flight response occurs, we don't really have control in stopping it. So identifying a trigger is kind of the first step to being able to hopefully begin to take back control.
Okay, so it sounds like once people are able to identify their triggers,
Hmm.
then they're able to respond instead of reacting. Is that
Hmm.
accurate?
Yeah, they can begin to have choice and take action. And then if they're interacting with a therapist, then hopefully they're going to begin to learn coping strategies to help them in that moment also. Yeah, yeah,
Wonderful. So, what are some common trauma responses?
yeah. So there are actually four trauma responses. We typically talk about fight or flight. Um, in terms of when you have a response, there's actually also going to be freeze and then fawn. And fawn doesn't get much focus, but that freeze and fawn are actually also very important ones to recognize because they're not the anxious tension, but the freeze is actually where you kind of shut down, and just like you freeze, your emotions and your responses just kind of go flat, and sometimes there can be something called dissociation that can occur there. Fawn is like the kind of, it's like an old word, but to fawn is to appease or to please. And so someone may be trying to, help to navigate so that more trauma might not occur, in certain situations. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for explaining those because those terms are also widely used, but they're not always defined. And so I really appreciate you
Yeah.
explaining those for listeners because I think it would help those people listening to identify their own responses and how
Hmm.
that is related to trauma. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate that insight. Now, there are also delayed trauma responses. Could you tell us more about that?
A delayed trauma response may be somewhat like how my husband, compartmentalized and pushed it down, and so didn't interact with, um, yeah, having trauma response because it was almost forgotten. Sometimes, with certain children with trauma, they don't even remember it cognitively, with their rational thinking brain because that trauma is actually stored in the emotional brain, with your emotional memory. And so sometimes, trauma isn't remembered. Um, yeah, but it still affects you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really important too, I think, because
Hmm.
sometimes people have these feelings and reactions and they may not even know where they're coming from because it was so long ago, or those emotions were pushed down, or those memories were suppressed because they were so painful.
Yes.
So, yeah, I think that's an important one to consider as well. But you spoke about negative coping mechanisms, which I know many people are familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But what are some positive coping mechanisms that people
Hmm.
can begin to incorporate?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ones, but because trauma itself is stored in that emotional brain, and so it has effects on your body. Different body focused coping strategies can really help to kind of calm ourselves down or to positively help. Breathing is a wonderful tool to help with calming or coping, positively. There are a number of different breathing strategies. My favorite is going to be boxed breathing. My therapist, my most recent one that I did a lot of EMDR work with, she helped me to know the boxed breathing and also grounding techniques. I tried both, but for me, the boxed breathing really was effective. And so boxed breathing, you're breathing in for 3 seconds, you hold for 3 seconds, and then you breathe out slowly for 3 seconds. You can do it a few times, but you just don't want to get lightheaded. But then you can begin to feel, at least for me, when I'm starting to feel tense, if I do that a few times, it just sort of decreases maybe the intensity of the feeling just a little bit, and then you can kind of do better. Other coping strategies that are useful, exercise, certainly, art, music, any type of movement or dance can be helpful. Some also really enjoy yoga or acupuncture to help. So going into nature, going outside, being in creation can be very calming, as well as if you're having uh, you're kind of increased with your stimuli. You're feeling tense, and maybe there's light and noise to just sort of decrease the stimulation that you're having, decrease the light, decrease the noise. Maybe be in a dark room for a minute can help.
I think you covered most of them.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I know you've covered quite a few, and I've used quite a few of these myself.
Okay.
And specifically, I remember I was getting my blood pressure taken, and
Mm,
somebody in my past was with me and was really upsetting me, and you could see my blood pressure rising. And so I
mm-hmm.
started to do the deep breathing, and I could see my blood pressure dropping. And so it really
Yes.
is effective, just even that simple deep breathing. So I do
Mm-hmm.
recommend, many of those for people. So I was hoping you could also talk about recommended therapies from healing from trauma,
Okay.
because I know that there are certain therapies that will be more effective than others in your experience.
Um, in terms of our experience, my husband, when he was starting therapy and he was in mental health crisis with the VA, he was started on CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is going to be focused on obviously your thinking, your cognition. He actually got significantly worse with his symptoms with that. And fast forward, and there were suicide attempts. And during that time, I was researching and looking for, good evidence-based trauma therapy that would be very helpful. And I came across EMDR therapy. What that stands for, it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And you can go onto their website, emdr.com. That's where I initially read about it. And as I was looking at it, it was kind of like this moment of hope. We were dealing with just day to day chaos and turmoil and fighting for his life, and reading about how EMDR, there's lots of research studies that have been done, and one that it talked about was with the veteran population and how EMDR helped them to decrease their PTSD symptoms significantly, even faster than I think it was CBT or one of the other therapies. And I knew that that was what he needed. It took about 6 to 8 months from that moment to find an EMDR therapist who also knew that trauma, who was experienced with that. Throughout that time, he also did DBT and another CPT. But when he got to EMDR and he was able to do even just a few sessions, his symptoms drastically improved. And so, obviously, that experience, not just the reading and the research, but that experience, it was, yeah, it was so wonderful, to see it in real life happening. MDR, I have also done for my own traumas, and if no one's familiar with it, um, what it does is it uses bilateral stimulation. So in the beginning, they would do movements with the eye back and forth. And it actually, it's almost like not replicating, but very similar to what happens during REM sleep. When there's a lot of processing and important things happening. And what the woman who founded it discovered was that it would decrease kind of the intensity or the dysregulation. This bilateral movement with the eyes. It's anything that would use both sides of your body. My favorite is actually holding the vibrating paddles because I can just close my eyes as I am processing and working through trauma. With EMDR, what it does is it is actually able to access where those stuck memories are in your brain, and then it begins to reintegrate them and kind of create new neural pathways to help decrease the symptoms. So that is why I'm a believer in EMDR. It's powerful. And also from a veteran side, some people, the trauma is so hard to talk about. And with EMDR, there can be wonderful healing where you don't actually even have to talk, because the body is healing or the brain is healing itself. So yeah, there's a couple other body-focused therapies I can just mention real quick. I have not undergone them myself, but I have read good things about them because EMDR might not be for everyone, but some of the other ones are going to be somatic experiencing sensorimotor psychotherapy. And then one last that I've been hearing about and I've been doing some reading on is it deals with the vagus nerve, and it is polyvagal theory. And those are three different other ones that focus more on the body and trying to interact with how the body is the imprint of trauma. Polyvagal is dealing more with kind of that sense of safety that you deal with and trying to have the person feel safe. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you mentioning all of these different types of body-based therapies because, everyone responds a little bit differently. And as you said, sometimes it might be just so painful that you might not want to talk through every single
Yes.
thing. Like you said, with cognitive behavioral therapy, while it's really good for some things, it may not be good in every single situation.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned DBT. And so I wanted just to clarify for people what DBT is and maybe how it differs from cognitive behavioral therapy so that people are aware and can make
Yeah,
choices when they're seeking a practitioner.
certainly. DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy, and it is interacting more with mindfulness. It was used for my husband because there was so much dysregulation that they couldn't continue working on trauma until he was in a stable place. And so it was kind of trying to maybe bring some coping strategies, trying to keep him to be a little bit more stable. That's about as much as I can say on it. But yeah, dealing with mindfulness and helping to be more balanced, I guess. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that
Yeah.
clarification. And so, kind of along those lines, what would you suggest someone look for in a mental health professional for trauma? Because they're not all educated in the same way or have the same focus that
hmm
it may not be as beneficial as we were talking about before.
Certainly, that relationship is so significant because you are entering into, you're going to have to talk a little bit, but you're entering into a space where you're interacting with your emotional pain. You're interacting with some of your most difficult and deepest and darkest things that you struggle with. And so there needs to be a very trusted relationship, one where you feel safe and there is empathy and compassion present for that client practitioner relationship. I did create a resource guiding people through the steps. 12 steps actually is what it came to, that the 12 steps I took to find the therapist for my husband, and then also when I have gone through steps to find a therapist for myself. It shows vital pieces that I think are important to consider as you are walking through. The first step is going to be identifying and coming to the realization that you actually need therapy, or that you may need therapy, because sometimes we're not quite ready to be very, absolute, like, well, I might need therapy. I may need to seek a professional. And, that coming to that step, like for me, coming to the moment where I said out loud, I have PTSD, that was a powerful moment. It's a powerful moment to be able to state the reality, and not in shame, not in blame, not just to be able to state what is actual, and then to do something about it.
But that's so true because you can't really address what's not acknowledged. And so that is a
Mm-hmm.
very vital first step
Yes.
in seeking the right help for yourself. And that is a strength as well. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
weakness that you might need help to get through something that's traumatic. And we're not created to be in isolation. We're created to be in
Mm-hmm.
relationship with others and with God. And I think that this can be a
Yes.
piece of that. So, how can someone find an EMDR practitioner?
Well, honestly, on EMDR.com is typically going to be the easiest way, because it actually has practitioners across the world. So, like all across the world, you can type in where you live and find someone who does EMDR. And then obviously, then you're going to need to take a look. And obviously, this is in my resource, but take a look at other things that would be important. So, like one would be, do they either share the same faith as you, or do they support or will support the beliefs that you have? Because one thing I found, is that it was incredibly important when I was going into the most intimate things, and struggles and thoughts, to be able to have someone who supported my beliefs. And so I didn't have to try to parse what they said through this filter of, okay, do I agree with that? Do I not? It was, they're supporting all of me, my holistic self, mind, body, and spirit. And then we can, obviously seek healing together. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that because a lot of times insurance will pay for secular therapy, but not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
faith-based. And there is sort of this process where if I share something that's faith-based, are they going to think I'm hearing voices when it's the Holy Spirit?
Mm-hmm.
Things like
Mm-hmm.
that, it
Yeah.
takes an additional step to think through when you're
Yeah.
seeking therapy with a secular counselor. But that's not to say that
Mm-hmm.
those secular counselors can't teach you, new skills or help you through things as well. So,
Absolutely. And secular counselors, they're gonna say, um, whether or not they can support your beliefs and bring those into your counseling sessions. And so that'd be a question to ask. Hey, these are my beliefs, and in terms of my desire, how are you able to bring that in? And then that's how you can begin to make those decisions as to, is this a good relationship or not? Yeah. Yep. Shop around,
yeah.
so yeah.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah.
So now how have you seen God heal in your own life and in your husband's life? How have you
How
seen
have
him come through?
mhm. He's come through a lot. My goodness. I already, I think, mentioned that I grew in my prayer life so significantly. During that almost 2 years of mental health crisis, Satan would give him new ways, new ideas in the night of how to end his life. And so I began to realize that the nighttime was a time of intense attack. And so before we'd go to bed, I'd be praying, spiritual warfare prayers over him and over our house and over our children. And then I also had a few very trusted spiritual warfare prayers as well, trusted, wonderful friends who would also be praying, each night as well. I'd text them, hey, can you pray? And I knew they would, knew that we were surrounded. So that certainly was a walk by faith, day by day, night by night process, where it would, God would protect his mind. And, oh, how was the night? I didn't have anything. Or, sometimes there would be stuff, and then we'd be praying over that and talking about it. During all of that time, one thing I asked the Lord was to redeem our story. There were enough miracles and God things that occurred, that I knew that our story was not just for us. I knew it was for others, but I didn't know when. In the beginning of caring for him, and a lot of those with trauma understand there's guilt and shame present. And in the beginning, he couldn't be exposed. He needed for no one to know, what he was dealing with. And so as you go forward, I wasn't sure when we'd be able, to share this. And it took a lot of years, but now we're getting to, to help others, hopefully in the midst of whatever darkness they're walking through. I've seen the
Yeah.
miracles of God, and they're not just for us. So, yeah.
Right, exactly. And so that also, I think, what you mentioned about having a tight knit spiritual community as a source of
Hmm.
support is really important to have friends that you can count on and ask for prayer for, and know
Hmm.
that you are surrounded and lifted up in those times of struggle. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
I know that
Yeah.
many will benefit from your family's story. So, do you have any tips about how people can begin to integrate their faith into their therapy?
So first is going to be really, like I said, and it's not a wrong thing to shop around and to look for the right practitioner. You can also, as you're looking at and reading about them, you can actually, some of them will offer like a 10 or 15 minute phone call, free consultation, and I did that with a few, and that was incredibly helpful because then you can understand, and gain some rapport and know, okay, are they going to help? Are we able to connect well and talk through things? So I've always tried to look for therapists for myself that are either believers or where there's some type of a faith background, for them to be able to bring it in. Again, I said before that you could use a secular therapist to support your faith also. With my last therapist, when we were doing our intensive EMDR sessions, it was really neat because she was able to bring in the faith into the EMDR time itself. So, sometimes you're gonna maybe be looking for a strong person or safe person or something, or someone who can give you wisdom and discernment. And so she would ask, is there anyone in your life, or maybe there's someone in the Bible that you can bring to mind right now. And so it was very powerful to bring that into EMDR. And I think that really aided me, in terms of using all of my strengths for healing.
That's a great tip. Thanks so much for sharing that, because I'm
Yeah.
sure there are listeners who are thinking that might be really a helpful strategy for them.
Hmm.
Do you have any
Yeah.
last thoughts to share with listeners today?
I say this all the time, but you are not alone in your battle. We can feel very alone when we are walking through hard things, or when we are dealing with our own trauma, or we are dealing with significant crisis for a family member. And God is in the business of redeeming and restoring. In terms of that redemption that I talked about, I'm actually in the process, I don't think I mentioned it before, and I apologize. I'm in the process of writing a book for the caregivers of mental health crisis, and it will be published next year in 25. But grabbing a hold of the promises in the Bible, grabbing a hold of truth, is something that I would do as I was walking through so much hardship and suffering. Um, and if I can share one of my verses, is that okay? Yeah,
Yes,
okay,
please.
okay. I have a number of
Yes.
them, but the one that I was thinking of with this is Isaiah 43:19. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. In that chapter right before, God is talking about how he led the Israelites when they were at the Red Sea, when there was no way out. The Egyptian army was coming fast to kill them, and they were between the army and water, and God opened up the Red Sea and made a way where there was no way. And just God is able to do new things. He is in the business of restoring and redeeming. The same God that was then is the same God that's now. And my website again, choosejoyinthemidst.com. Yeah, that's what I'd leave everyone with.
Yeah, I just love that verse as well. It's also one of my favorites. So thank you for
Mm,
sharing it and for
for sure.
explaining that, God, He does want to restore, He does want to
Hmm.
heal, and He is in the business of caring for His people. And so through that, there are different ways that we can explore healing. Sometimes it's miraculous and sometimes
Hmm.
it's a process. But
Yes.
often we need other people to do that. So I
Yes.
appreciate you sharing all of your wisdom and expertise. And congratulations on your book. So
Thank
if people want
you.
to find out more about you or get a copy of your book or your resources, how
Hmm.
can they do that?
Well, I think you're going to be putting a link for people to be able to get to the resources. And when you sign up for a resource, you get on my email list. That's going to be the easiest way. But you can also go to choosejoyinthemidst.com. That's my website. And again, you can sign up, you can read stuff I've written. I'm on most of the social media platform. And then hopefully, yeah, like I said, maybe spring of 25 is when the book will come out. I am right now in the middle. I've finished about half of my manuscript and doing book design right now. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I'm sure that's also going to be a great resource for people. So it
Hmm.
sounds like the best thing is to get your free resources and
Yeah.
then get on her email list so that you'll know when this book is coming out.
Yes.
So
Yes.
thank you so much, Amber, for all of your wisdom and sharing your experience. I know it's really going to touch a lot of lives. So God
Mhm.
bless your family and your ministry. So much
Mm.
appreciated.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'm so glad to be on here, and what you're doing is amazing as well.
All right. Well, take care and we'll see you next time, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks for joining me. I hope this episode has blessed you. If so, please subscribe, comment, and share. It's a great way to spread the love and keep good content rolling. As a reminder, this podcast is purely for informational and educational purposes only. Listening to content is not a replacement for medical or mental health care. Please make decisions with your personal care providers. Stay tuned for next week's episode. But if you want more content or free resources in the meantime, head over to FromBudToBloom.com. See you next time. Until then, live fully free in Christ.